In the 11th century, the medical understanding of the female body across Christian Europe was not medicine. It was theology. The female body was the site of original sin, the vessel of transgression, the origin of mortality itself. Childbirth was punishment, explicitly sanctioned by the Book of Genesis, and any attempt to alleviate its pain was not compassion but heresy, an interference with divine judgment that had been operating without modification since the expulsion from Eden. Women died in childbirth in numbers that the Church considered acceptable collateral consequence of a transgression that had occurred before recorded history. Women's gynecological conditions were treated with prayer, not observation, with confession, not diagnosis, with the intercession of saints whose domains covered fertility and labor, not with any systematic understanding of the biological processes involved. The idea that a physician might examine, document, and develop treatment protocols for the pathologies and reproductive processes of the female body was not simply uncommon. In most of Christian Europe, it was unthinkable, theologically prohibited, and in some formulations an act of impiety. Except in Salerno, and except by a woman, the Church and the Academy would spend the following 8 centuries attempting to erase. Welcome back to Medusa Awakened, where we unearth the voices they tried to bury. Salerno, on the Tyrrhenian coast of what is now southern Italy, was in the 11th century the most extraordinary medical institution in the Western world. The Scuola Medica Salernitana operated on a principle so radical for its context that it reads today as elementary, that medicine should be based on observation and reason rather than scripture and prayer, and that anyone with the intellectual capacity to practice it should be permitted to do so, regardless of sex, religion, or cultural origin. The school drew simultaneously on Greek, Arab, and Jewish medical traditions, producing a synthesis of empirical knowledge utterly unlike anything the monastery libraries of Northern Europe contained, and unlike the universities that would eventually emerge under direct ecclesiastical control in the 12th and 13th centuries. Salerno permitted women to study and to practice, not grudgingly, not as a curiosity, but as recognized practitioners and authorities. The women physicians of Salerno were known collectively as the mulierum Salernitani. They were magistrae, masters of their discipline, with students, clinical practices, and scholarly reputations. Among them, by the middle of the 11th century, one had become the preeminent medical authority in the region, her reputation extending to a Europe desperate for medical knowledge it could not find within monastery walls. Her name was Trotula. She came from a noble Salernitan family, with the education and social position that gave her access to the school's full resources. She had a mind that combined rigorous empirical observation with a willingness to think about the human body in ways that the theological framework of her era made almost criminally dangerous. Women came to her specifically because she was a woman, because the religious taboo against male physicians examining female patients was so deeply embedded in the culture of the era that many women would suffer and die from treatable conditions rather than submit to examination by a man. Trotula was their only option for care that was both medically competent and socially and religiously permissible. She became, by necessity and by intellectual force, the most experienced gynecologist in Europe. The texts that emerged from her practice constitute the most important medical writing produced in 11th century Europe. The collection scholars call the Trotula, which required decades of careful philological work to disaggregate and attribute, centers on a core text traditionally titled De Passionibus Mulierum ante in et postpartum, on the conditions of women before, during, and after childbirth. The implications of this work, read against its historical context, are extraordinary. The Church taught that the pain of childbirth was not a medical problem to be addressed, but a divine sentence to be endured, the embodied consequence of Eve's choice in the garden. Trotula refused this framework as a physician and a scientist. She developed protocols for managing the pain and complications of labor using botanical preparations that functioned as obstetric anesthesia, applying pharmacological knowledge to a domain that theology had declared forbidden to human intervention. She documented gynecological conditions that no practitioner in the Western tradition had systematically described: menstrual irregularities, uterine prolapse, difficulties of conception, complications of pregnancy and delivery, all analyzed with the precision of a clinician whose knowledge came from observation, rather than inherited assumption. And she made an argument so scientifically advanced and so contrary to theological orthodoxy that it would not achieve mainstream medical acceptance for centuries, that infertility was not a curse delivered exclusively to women as divine punishment, that its causes could reside in the male partner with equal biological probability, and that a systematic empirical investigation of both parties was the appropriate clinical response. She was proposing reproductive medicine as a rational science at a moment when the dominant European culture classified reproduction as sacred mystery beyond the reach of investigation. What happened to her work in the centuries that followed is a story of deliberate institutional violence against a body of knowledge too useful to destroy and too threatening to acknowledge. As medicine moved from independent institutions like Salerno into the universities of the 12th and 13th centuries, it moved under ecclesiastical oversight that excluded women by statute. The university was a male institution by definition and by deliberate design. The existence of Trotula's texts created a structural problem the new medical establishment could not solve with elegance. The texts were too embedded in practice to suppress. Physicians across Europe used them, copied them, and taught from them. But a woman's name in the position of authority, as the originating source of gynecological knowledge that university-trained male physicians were actively deploying, was institutionally impossible. The solution that copyists and commentators developed was consistent and systematic. They altered the texts. They fragmented them, combining sections with material from other sources to obscure the original composition. They modified the name. Trotula became Trotus in some manuscripts, a masculine form of the same name, transforming the author's sex without requiring any other explanation. Other texts were attributed to her husband, the physician Johannes Platearius, on the assumption that a woman's medical knowledge must have originated with a man. Some were attributed to a fictional male author, constructed specifically to provide the works with a masculine point of origin. Others were stripped of identifying attribution and presented as traditional wisdom without a named author, which in practice meant available for attribution by whoever had institutional authority to claim them. The most durable form of erasure was the argument that Trotula herself had never existed, that the name referred to a tradition rather than an individual, that a woman of her described significance was a historical impossibility and therefore a legend. The argument was circular and self-confirming. A woman of such significance was impossible, therefore she did not exist. Therefore, the evidence of her existence must be otherwise explained. If you believe history has been manipulated to erase the brilliant minds of the women who built our understanding of the human body, subscribe to Medusa Awakened. Let us rewrite the narrative together. The historians of the Renaissance and Enlightenment who possessed the philological tools to examine medieval texts systematically were also embedded in intellectual traditions that could not absorb the idea of an authoritative female physician. The secular scholarship of those centuries brought rigorous methods to medieval sources, while operating inside assumptions that consistently steered toward masculine attribution. Scholars who found the evidence for a female author convincing encountered the accumulated institutional weight of several centuries of altered texts, masculine names, and repeated claims that her existence was a medieval fantasy. The argument that she was fictional was not a disinterested academic conclusion. It was the product of a scholarly tradition consistently motivated to reach it, that had inherited altered manuscripts as its primary evidence and treated them as authentic while dismissing traces of original female authorship as error or interpolation. Her name survived in the margins of manuscripts the Inquisition had not reached in time, in citations from practitioners working at the periphery of ecclesiastical authority, in the persistent clinical correspondence between the treatments documented in her texts and the gynecological realities they addressed so precisely that attribution to any other source required determined special pleading. The modern recovery of her intellectual contribution is primarily the work of Monica Green, whose decades of textual scholarship have done more than any other body of research to distinguish what Trotula wrote from what was added, altered, or attributed to her name by later hands with an institutional interest in the outcome. Modern gynecology operates on foundations first articulated in Salerno in the 11th century by a woman the official record declared impossible. Systematic clinical observation of gynecological conditions, the argument that infertility has multiple causes including male factor origins. Pharmacological management of obstetric pain, the recognition that women's medicine required its own dedicated body of knowledge. These propositions appear in Trotula's work centuries before they appear anywhere else in the Western medical tradition. The Church classified the body as sacred and suffering as merited. She classified them as problems admitting of rational solution. The institutional response was to classify her as a myth. They altered her name, invented masculine authors, and trained generations of scholars to treat evidence of her existence as anachronism. The anatomy did not cooperate with the censorship. The science she practiced saved lives that theology had condemned to be lost. Her words survived in the margins of the manuscripts that could not all be destroyed. And every time a physician today treats a gynecological condition, evaluates infertility in both partners, or manages obstetric pain, they are working inside a tradition whose first systematic architect was a woman in 11th century Salerno, whose name the official record spent 800 years suppressing, and is only now beginning, imperfectly and belatedly, to restore. Her name was Trotula of Salerno. She invented gynecology as a science. The Church called her impossible. The manuscripts called her back.